The story began with a man bleeding heavily and struggling to breathe. He reflected on how far they had come as laser beams rained down across the battlefield. He desperately clung to the hope that they might still defeat the enemy, but in an instant, something pierced through his chest. He froze in shock. It took him a moment to realize that he had been turned into a donut. He dropped to his knees as the pain finally registered. It was a fatal blow. He collapsed face first onto the ground while thinking about how he would die without accomplishing anything. Through his blurry vision, he stared ahead at the flying humanoid creature known as the Liquidator, mankind's greatest enemy. One day, this unknown being suddenly appeared and wiped out an entire continent. Because of monsters like it, humanity formed a special force to defend the world. The first member was a man famous for surviving a massive meteor strike with nothing but a shield, earning him the title of the world's greatest shield, Brian Miller. There was also the great sage Bella Albright, who possessed power equal to an entire military division. Alongside her stood the divine archer Jacob Bloomfield, who once killed a high-level dragon with a single arrow. Then there was the strongest swordsman alive, the Sword Saint Amy White. And lastly, there was their group, the support unit. Corpses were scattered across the battlefield while the dying man, our MC Gray Lee, lay among them. As nothing more than a foot soldier, he believed they were merely sacrificial pawns. He watched the elite fighters battle the Liquidator and realized they existed on a completely different level. He already knew that graduates of the World Union Academy were exceptional, but he never imagined the gap between them would be this massive. The elites launched powerful attacks that managed to strike the Liquidator, yet Gray only felt more hopeless. He questioned whether the support unit's presence even mattered. Amy White continued exchanging blows with the monster using blinding sword techniques to pressure it. Gray gritted his teeth as tears formed in his eyes. Witnessing such an overwhelming difference despite all his hard work crushed him inside. The Liquidator effortlessly dodged her attacks until one blade barely scratched him. Surprisingly, he praised Amy for managing to injure him. Then his expression changed. In a single instant, he unleashed a strike so fast that it sliced the elite warrior clean in half. Blood sprayed everywhere as her body collapsed. Gray's eyes widened in horror. The Liquidator had finally stopped playing around. He could not believe the elites were eliminated with one blow. At that moment, he accepted the painful truth that victory was impossible. Gray remained lying in his pool of blood, yet strangely, he was still conscious. A long time had passed since his heart had been pierced, so he could not understand why he remained alive. As drops of blood fell to the ground, a weak voice suddenly echoed. The mysterious voice declared that it had finally found him. The blood transformed into a tiny light before forming a glowing message. It called for Gray Lee to come forth because he wielded immense power. Suddenly, Gray awoke in shock. He found himself in a dark, empty place filled with ancient stone structures. Confused, he wondered if this barren land was the afterlife. Then he noticed someone seated upon a throne. The figure resembled a god wearing black clothing with horns, a veil covering its forehead, and a glowing golden mark on its chest. Its calm expression radiated authority. The mysterious being informed Gray that he had not died and explained that his physical injuries had already healed. Gray immediately looked at the screen displaying his battered body and asked if the mysterious being was the one who healed him. The figure explained that the healing was actually Gray's own power. That revelation left him confused because even the being admitted it could not fully analyze Gray's abilities. However, it guaranteed that Gray possessed power greater than the Liquidators if he could properly control it. Gray immediately wondered if that meant they could still win the battle. The mysterious being admitted that victory was uncertain and advised Gray not to place too much hope in it yet. Even so, it believed the Liquidator had to be destroyed. The figure suddenly stood up and sliced Gray's chest, causing a bright blue light to erupt from his body. A magic circle formed over his chest while the being declared that it would lend him its power. Moments later, Gray awakened beside his bloodied corpse and grabbed his sword. Dark energy covered the blade's edge while the mysterious being explained that the power belonged to Gray himself, though it could not normally be seen with the naked eye. Gray finally understood. The Liquidator quickly noticed him, and without hesitation, Gray launched an attack. The slash scratched the monster's chest, causing it to stare at him in disbelief. It could not believe that another strong fighter remained alive. Gray realized his attack had actually damaged the creature and immediately charged again. Although he had been told his power surpassed the Liquidator's, the monster warned him not to underestimate it. Before Gray could react, everything suddenly went black. It took him several moments to understand what had happened. His body had been sliced completely in half, leaving only his lower torso standing as blood erupted like a fountain. The Liquidator praised him for forcing it to use its true power. Suddenly, black mist engulfed the battlefield and a hooded man appeared, wielding a gigantic black sword. His body resembled dark flames, and his masked appearance confused the Liquidator. The Liquidator instantly created a barrier around itself. Part of the black flames vanished, revealing the left side of Gray Lee's face beneath the dark power. Shocked, the Liquidator questioned whether Gray was truly human. Gray answered only with a glare before attacking again. His sword slammed against the barrier as he desperately pushed forward. Then the Liquidator noticed cracks forming across the shield. The barrier shattered and Gray's blade sliced through him. Once again, the monster questioned if Gray was really human. Gray admitted that he was beginning to wonder the same thing himself. Even after surviving such injuries, Gray acknowledged that the Liquidator's strength was terrifying. The monster was equally shocked that Gray still lived. It began breathing heavily before approaching him and whispering that it would crush him repeatedly until he finally died. But Gray attacked first, cutting into the liquidator and splattering its yellow blood across the battlefield. The monster called him a monster in return, but refused to lose there. Light surrounded its body as it gathered even greater power. It joined its hands together, creating a massive magic circle before declaring that time was up. Gray tightened his grip on his gigantic sword while waiting for the next attack. Suddenly, the entire battlefield became night. Though surprised, Gray immediately moved behind the liquidator, aiming for its neck, but his sword was blocked by another barrier. The liquidator informed him that resistance was futile because within the plane of true dusk, nothing could harm him. The liquidator coldly advised Gray to stop resisting and instead admire the stars. Gray's eyes widened as a glowing star reflected in his pupils. The light grew larger and brighter until it resembled a miniature sun falling from the heavens. The liquidator admired its beauty moments before the star crashed into the battlefield with catastrophic force. The impact created a massive crater and completely erased Gray from sight. The liquidator assumed Gray could never regenerate if his body had been reduced to dust. However, a portal suddenly formed in the sky, expanding into a gigantic magic circle. Then another voice echoed throughout the battlefield, acknowledging the enormous amount of power gathered there. The liquidator immediately recognized the voice as Kronos. Kronos called out to the one who wielded great power and asked if Gray could still hear him. Since Gray had exhausted all his power, Kronos decided to send him back to the past. Furious, the liquidator cursed at Kronos, while the mysterious being calmly explained that this was the only thing left he could do. A gigantic magic clock appeared and began ticking backward. When the countdown reached 1, Kronos entrusted the fate of the world to Gray Lee. In the next moment, Gray suddenly woke up lying in a grassy field beneath a bright sky. Confused, he looked around at the peaceful scenery. The grass swayed gently under the sunlight while Gray realized that somehow he had returned to the past. He looked to his right and immediately recognized his hometown, Renato Village. Confusion filled his face, because the village should not have existed anymore. It had been destroyed 15 years ago. That was when he remembered what Kronos told him before sending him back. He truly had returned to the past. Supporting himself with one hand, Gray noticed the wound on his body and recalled how he used to get bullied by Belder and his gang around this time. He told himself that he would never allow weaklings like them to beat him again. Still, he knew they were stronger than the old version of himself, so defeating them would not be easy. He sighed and admitted that defeating the liquidator still felt like an impossible dream. For now, he decided he would avoid conflict until he became stronger because he had no intention of getting injured again. Unfortunately, while walking through the forest, he ran into the exact people he wanted to avoid. Standing in front of him was the biggest bully of them all, Belder, accompanied by 3 other young men. Belder smirked and stated that he had spent a lot of time searching for him. Gray immediately became cautious. Without warning, Belder tossed a sword onto the ground in front of him and ordered him to pick it up. Gray looked confused, which caused Belder to angrily accuse him of pretending to be dumb. Belder explained that he wanted a mock battle. Gray calmly refused and explained that his injuries had not healed yet. He thanked Belder for the invitation and stated that he could not participate until he recovered. Belder dismissed his concerns and claimed there was nothing to worry about because the sword was blunt. Gray reasoned that even a dull blade was still a heavy piece of iron capable of seriously injuring someone if struck incorrectly. Annoyed, Belder shouted for him to shut up and declared that Gray had no right to refuse. He even stated that if Gray disliked swords so much, then he could simply fight barehanded. Belder instantly charged toward him. Gray was caught off guard because it was obvious this was no harmless mock battle. The guy genuinely intended to hurt him despite him being unarmed. Suddenly, Gray remembered something the military doctor once told him before he was sent back in time. The doctor explained that his swordsmanship never improved because of an injury he suffered during childhood. Looking back now, Gray realized that injury marked the beginning of his miserable life. Belder swung his sword, but Gray sidestepped the attack effortlessly. That immediately confused him. Belder clicked his tongue in frustration while Gray wondered if Belder's attacks had always been this slow. Another slash came toward him, but Gray smoothly ducked underneath it. The fight began to resemble a dance where Belder attacked repeatedly while Gray effortlessly evaded every strike. Then Gray realized the truth. It was not that Belder was slow, he himself had become faster. Frustrated that he could not land a hit, Belder swung again. The blade passed inches away from Gray's face before Gray swiftly moved forward and closed the distance between them. The other 3 young men stared in shock and commented that Gray seemed like an entirely different person. Gray calmly picked up the fallen sword and acknowledged that while his current body was weaker than before, he still retained all the memories and experience from countless battles. Belder suddenly leapt from behind, attempting to slash him, but Gray instantly blocked the strike with his uninjured hand. The impact knocked Belder backward, causing him to groan in pain. Gray was surprised that such a simple counterattack was enough to send him flying. He briefly wondered if it was even fair fighting amateurs like them, but he quickly dismissed the thought. These were the same trash who tormented him simply because he used to be weak. This time, things were different. Gray attacked again, forcing Belder to drop his sword immediately. Belder cursed loudly while Gray calmly observed that he clearly had never been trained to properly receive a sword strike. Gray stepped in front of Belder and reassured him that there was nothing to worry about. While gripping the sword, he reminded Belder that he was the one who claimed a blunt blade was completely safe. Then Gray struck him across the shoulder. Blood splattered across Belder's face, causing him to scream in terror before collapsing onto his knees. Gray was shocked because the sword truly was dull. If it had been sharp, Belder might have died instantly. Gray glared at him before delivering another strike straight to his nose. Blood poured out as Belder fell onto his back, crying in pain. Gray deliberately continued attacking with the blunt edge before towering over him and asking why he was screaming so much. After all, Belder was the one who insisted that blunt swords were harmless. Gray flashed a devilish grin, causing genuine fear to appear on Belder's face. Panicking, Belder shouted for the other 3 young men to stop standing around and help him beat Gray down. However, they hesitated because Gray had suddenly become terrifyingly strong. One of them nervously suggested attacking together from behind. They surrounded him cautiously while Gray calmly asked if they wanted another beating. Belder desperately ordered them to kill him. Gray originally intended to overlook everything, but after hearing that, he changed his mind entirely. Soon the forest echoed with painful screams. By the end of it all, the 4 bullies were covered in bruises with massive bumps on their heads. The group meekly knelt before Gray, with their hands resting on their laps, while Gray reflected on how terrified he used to be of them. He asked whether they belonged to the Badisariya swordsmanship dojo. Belder awkwardly admitted that it was something like that. One of the boys added that they had stopped attending recently because they believed they were already strong enough. In his mind, Gray questioned what kind of delusional standards they used to measure strength. Even so, he realized the dojo itself could still be useful. He needed an introduction because the dojo only accepted students through referrals. Belder immediately refused and told him to ask someone else, because if his master discovered he lost to Gray, he could not imagine the punishment waiting for him. Gray casually swung the sword near Belder's face, and suggested they continue the fight if he refused. Naturally, Belder panicked. He instantly pointed toward the dojo while running away, screaming that it was in that direction. The others hurried after him while yelling for him not to abandon them. Eventually, they entered the city together. Belder nervously asked Gray why he wanted to join the dojo in the first place. Gray explained that the dojo possessed a recommendation slot for the academy. Belder recalled hearing rumors about it before. Gray confirmed that obtaining that recommendation was exactly why he wanted to join. One of the lackeys nervously commented that Gray already seemed strong enough without entering the academy. Gray admitted it would be nice if that level of strength was truly enough. However, he personally witnessed the world's strongest fighters get slaughtered by the Liquidator. Even after borrowing Kronos' power, he still failed to seriously injure the monster once it stopped holding back. Gray could not even imagine how powerful he needed to become in order to defeat such a being. Still, he had finally found a clue. During his clash against the Liquidator, he briefly managed to control the dark power within him. At that moment, he focused entirely on the swordsmanship taught by the Sword Saint. Gray realized that if he had trained under the same conditions as Amy White, the outcome of the battle might have changed. He understood now why Kronos sent him back to this point in time. Soon they arrived at the dojo where a woman immediately confronted them. She asked if those idiots seriously tried bullying a civilian using the swordsmanship she taught them only to get beaten senseless instead. Clicking her tongue in annoyance, the woman revealed herself as Saria, the instructor of the swordsmanship dojo. Belder desperately tried to defend himself by insisting it was only supposed to be a mock battle. Before he could finish speaking, Saria punched him so hard that he was blasted into the wall with a loud crash. The other 3 had their eyes widened in shock and trembled in fear. She knew he was just making up excuses. She told them that if he calls beating up someone unarmed a mock battle, then it would mean that what she did just then was also a mock battle. She pointed her sword at his eyes while telling him to leave and never return. She told them that they can no longer call themselves a student of the dojo from then on. They all replied yes and scurried away. She sat in front of Gray and apologized. She acknowledged that her former students caused him a lot of trouble. He replied that there's no need to worry about it. She thanked him for his understanding, and then she brought up the topic that he wanted to get a recommendation to the academy. She wanted to apologize for the trouble Belder and those guys caused. But as much as she'd like to write a letter of recommendation, she had to confirm his abilities first. She handed him a wooden sword. Gray accepted. She told him that he could have the first move and encouraged him to come to her whenever he's ready. He started attacking her. The dojo started evaluating his moves. She could see that his swordsmanship is quite practical for his age. She could sense that it is as if he's been through countless battles before. She attacked and he deflected it. She understood that Belder and the others are no match for him. She could tell that his style is mostly self-taught, but every so often his swordplay looks similar to what is taught in the academy. It made her curious if someone had taught him. She could tell his swordsmanship is rough, but admitted that he may have the talent, which is why she could say that he's a diamond in the rough. It was about time they wrapped up. She attacked. He was about to strike too. Their swords collided repeatedly as the duel intensified. Each clash echoed throughout the dojo grounds, while Saria gradually realized something was wrong. Gray was not losing momentum at all. She originally intended to test his abilities for only a short moment, but before she noticed it, she was already being forced to fight seriously. The pressure coming from Gray made her uneasy. For the first time in a long while, she felt fear creeping into her chest. Gray suddenly unleashed a heavy swing, powerful enough to force her backward. At first she assumed it was nothing more than a reckless attack. The opening in his stance immediately caught her attention, so she moved to finish the duel in one strike. However, the moment their swords met, her eyes widened in disbelief. Saria's sword had been sliced clean in half. Gray himself looked equally shocked because he recognized that same strange sensation from before. At that moment, he realized he still possessed traces of that dark power. Unfortunately, the power came with a severe cost. Intense pain surged through his body, causing him to collapse onto his knees. Alarmed, Saria rushed toward him and asked what happened. Gray quickly understood that his current body could not properly handle the power yet. His legs trembled violently, but he still forced himself to stand before reassuring her that he was fine. Even so, he mentally warned himself never to use that power recklessly again. Gray briefly considered explaining everything to Saria, but she stared at him with confusion while trying to understand what she had just witnessed. In the end, he abandoned the idea because he knew she would never believe such a ridiculous story. Instead, he simply explained that he got carried away during the sparring match. Deep down, however, Saria understood something was wrong. It was impossible for a dull wooden sword to cut through her blade, and she knew Gray understood that fact as well. Seeing her continue staring at him, Gray awkwardly asked if something was wrong. Saria realized he had no intention of discussing the incident further, so she shifted the conversation toward the recommendation letter he wanted. Gray immediately stated that he heard she could recommend students to the academy. Saria explained that she could indeed recommend him to the kingdom's greatest institution, the Royal Academy of Swordsmanship. However, she surprised him by admitting that she did not think he belonged there. Her words struck Gray hard. It confirmed the insecurity lingering deep inside him. Even after returning to the past, he still lacked the strength to truly fight monsters like the Liquidator. Aside from those brief moments where he borrowed that mysterious power, he could barely accomplish anything. Seeing his reaction, Saria clarified that there was actually another place she believed he should aim for instead. Then she mentioned the World Union Academy. Gray's eyes widened in shock the moment he heard the name. Saria explained that he should not settle for becoming merely the kingdom's strongest swordsman. In her eyes, he belonged among the world's finest fighters. Hearing that completely stunned him because the World Union Academy was the very place where legends like the Sword Saint originated. Gray nervously asked whether someone like him could really enter such an institution. Surprisingly, Saria bluntly answered that it was currently impossible. She pointed out that even Gray himself understood the condition of his body. Physically, he was nowhere near fit enough to properly wield a sword. She admitted that his skills might allow him to barely deceive instructors at the Royal Academy, but the World Union Academy was completely different. Every student there was a genuine monster. She questioned how someone with such a weak body managed to possess skills like his in the first place. Gray could not even argue against her because he knew she was absolutely right. Compared to the monsters from that academy, his current self stood no chance at all. His expression darkened as disappointment filled his face. Seeing that, Saria immediately questioned why he was already giving up. She reminded him that there were still 9 months left before the entrance exam. Gray weakly responded that 9 months was barely any time at all. Saria admitted that 9 months might not truly be enough, but she still wanted him to trust her. Then she asked whether he was prepared to suffer through hellish training for the next 9 months. Gray honestly admitted that he had no desire to suffer, but he still accepted her offer. He entrusted himself to her care for the remainder of the training period. Saria loved his answer. Suddenly, her entire demeanor changed, which instantly made Gray nervous. Wearing a devilish grin, she informed him that his personal hell was about to begin. Days quickly passed as Gray endured relentless training under her guidance. He constantly pushed his body to its limits while eating both delicious meals and horrifying dishes that barely looked edible. Every single day he sparred against Saria while continuously polishing his swordmanship. Gray trained with absolute determination because he refused to miss the academy entrance exam again. 8 months later, the changes in him became obvious. Saria proudly noticed how muscular and disciplined his body had become. At that point, she admitted that she no longer had anything left to teach him. She confidently encouraged him to leave for the academy and face the entrance exam without fear. Gray looked confused because there was still 1 month remaining before the test. Saria explained that taking such an important exam in an unfamiliar environment would not be easy, which was why arriving early would benefit him. She handed him enough money for travel expenses and food for an entire month. Gray hesitated to accept it and even joked that it felt like she was trying to kick him out of the village early. Saria dismissed his concern and claimed he was simply overthinking things. However, Gray suddenly brought up reports about an ogre nest discovered near the village that immediately caught her attention. He further pointed out that there were barely any guards protecting the area. Trying to remain calm, Saria casually responded that the matter had nothing to do with them. She assured him that reinforcements from the royal capital would eventually arrive, so there was no reason to worry. Then she urged him to focus entirely on the exam. Unfortunately, Gray knew she was lying. In his previous life, no help ever arrived. Right before the village was destroyed, Saria sacrificed her life attempting to defeat the ogres alone. Gray clearly remembered hearing the news of her death in the past. Even so, he simply nodded and stated that he understood what she wanted him to do. He thanked her for everything and informed her that he would leave soon. Saria smirked and wished him luck on the exam. Later that same night, horrifying sights filled the forest. Skeletons hung from trees while sticks pierced through their mouths. Saria carefully followed the scouts' reports through the woods until she discovered a trail of blood leading directly toward a disturbing cave-like den. Just as she prepared to move forward, a familiar voice suddenly stopped her. Looking upward, she found Gray casually sitting on a tree branch above her. Smiling lightly, he greeted her by calling her master. Saria stared at him in shock and immediately demanded to know why he was there instead of heading toward the academy. Gray calmly questioned her instead about the army from the royal capital that was supposedly coming to handle the ogre nest. Saria awkwardly explained that an emergency prevented the army from coming, so she decided to handle the situation personally. She confidently claimed that she alone would be enough because the scouts reported that the nest only contained around 40 to 50 ogres alongside a single elite ogre leader. She admitted that the number of minions would make things somewhat troublesome, but she still believed she could handle it herself. Thinking carefully about the information, Gray realized the nest itself was not truly dangerous. The real threat of ogres came from their intelligence and ability to coordinate attacks. He already knew how suicidal it was to fight while surrounded. More importantly, he knew one undeniable fact. If he allowed Saria to enter alone, she would die, and the village would eventually be destroyed. He had already witnessed that future with his own eyes. Gray firmly stated that he intended to accompany her. Saria instantly refused and insisted once again that she could manage everything alone. Gray tried convincing her by explaining that he wanted genuine combat experience before the academy exam. Then he directly asked whether she believed he would only get in her way. That question caused Saria to laugh because she already understood that Gray was stronger than her in sparring matches now. Even so, she argued that real combat against monsters was completely different. In dangerous missions like this, she believed experience mattered far more than talent. Realizing she would not change her mind easily, Gray proposed another idea instead. Curious, Saria asked what he meant. Gray calmly declared that if she continued refusing, then he would simply fight her, knock her unconscious, and eliminate the ogres himself. Judging from his stance and expression, she immediately understood he was completely serious. The proud dojo instructor became speechless for a moment before finally giving in. However, she accepted only under one condition. No matter what happened during the battle, Gray had to survive and return alive. Gray promised her that he would, and also wished for her survival in return. Under the moonlight, the two hid behind a massive boulder while observing the ogre colony from afar. The surrounding terrain offered almost no escape routes, which proved how confident the monsters were in their territory. Unfortunately, it also meant Gray and Saria would struggle to escape once the battle started. Since they were dealing with intelligent monsters, Gray decided they needed to proceed carefully. Saria quietly observed the colony and noticed that the elite ogre leader was nowhere outside. She guessed that it was likely resting inside the large tent near the center of the camp. Their best option was to reduce the number of enemies before the leader appeared. She instructed Gray to handle one side while she took care of the other. Gray agreed immediately before both of them charged into battle. One ogre sensed movement, but before it could react, Saria already appeared before it and decapitated it instantly. Another ogre watched the head roll across the ground and quickly alerted the others. Within seconds, a massive group of ogres rushed toward them. Meanwhile, Gray cut through enemy after enemy at incredible speed. Saria moved just as swiftly as the battlefield transformed into a complete bloodbath. Eventually, the two regrouped while ogre corpses littered the ground around them. Saria praised Gray's performance and even questioned whether this was truly his first real battle. However, Gray immediately warned her not to lower her guard because the real fight had not even begun yet. Deep inside, something felt completely wrong to him. The ogres they fought were far too weak. If the nest truly only contained enemies at that level, then Saria could have wiped them out alone without difficulty. That realization made him suspect the true danger was still hiding inside the tent. Suddenly, a pair of glowing red eyes appeared from the darkness within. The moment those eyes locked onto Gray, a terrible feeling crawled down his spine. Without hesitation, he immediately ordered Saria to retreat. He even shouted for her to run immediately. Shocked by his panic, Saria demanded to know what was happening. Seeing genuine fear on Gray's face, she instantly followed him. However, before they could escape, a massive figure suddenly leapt over them and landed directly in their path. To their surprise, an elite ogre blocked the exit. Saria scoffed after seeing it and jokingly remarked that it was an honor for the boss to greet them personally. Gray instantly corrected her and revealed that the elite ogre was not the true boss. Suddenly, another monstrous roar thundered throughout the area with enough force to make Saria cover her ears instinctively. Moments later, countless ogres charged toward them in a frenzy. Standing behind the horde was an enormous ogre radiating overwhelming pressure. Gray revealed that the creature was not merely an elite ogre, it was an ogre general, the true ruler of the nest. With the elite ogre blocking their escape route and the horde surrounding them, they were completely trapped. The ogre general did not even need to move because its terrifying presence alone crushed the atmosphere around them. The moment Saria heard its title, she instantly realized victory was impossible without outside help. She glanced toward the elite ogre before suggesting that they defeat it quickly and escape while they still could. Saria attacked first, but the elite ogre effortlessly blocked her strike. She concentrated and attacked again, barely managing to leave a shallow wound on its shoulder. To her horror, the injury instantly began healing. Gray explained that the ogre general's roar strengthened the ogres while greatly enhancing their regeneration. That was why the monsters suddenly felt far stronger than before. Even Saria was now struggling against a single elite. Gray continued fighting while telling Saria to focus only on protecting his back. He clarified that she did not need to win. She only needed to buy him time. Worried, Saria demanded to know what he intended to do. Gray answered that there was only one option remaining. He planned to kill the ogre general himself. One ogre slammed an axe against Gray's sword, while several others constantly attempted to flank him. Their attacks irritated him endlessly. Then a powerful swing shattered his blade completely. Gray immediately realized ordinary weapons could not withstand the strength of enhanced ogres. Another attack came toward him, forcing him to leap backward at the last possible second. Thankfully, he still carried a spare sword, though he knew it would not last long either. Noticing his situation, Saria tossed him her extra blade. Gray quickly thanked her before grabbing it. Even while dual-wielding swords, he understood he could not waste time fighting every monster there. His target was only the ogre general. Tightening his grip, Gray charged forward and cut through every ogre standing in his path. One of them barely managed to scratch his cheek as he pushed deeper into the horde. He blocked the strike as the ogre tried to force him back with its axe. He pushed harder with both swords. More ogres rushed toward him from every direction. The ogre general's weapon suddenly began to glow, followed by a deafening roar that made Gray instinctively flinch. Right after that, the ogres became visibly stronger and charged at him once more. Gray quickly realized the general had already figured out his strategy. Another roar echoed across the battlefield, and this time Gray understood one thing clearly. The creature was far smarter than he expected. His sword collided against the ogre's axe and the impact forced him backward, but he immediately regained his footing and moved again. He dashed through the battlefield, cutting down every ogre in his path, knowing he didn't have the luxury of fighting them one by one. Suddenly, one of the ogres lunged at him and pinned him down while another raised its axe overhead. Gray instantly slashed the one clinging to him across the neck. At that moment, he realized the ogres were deliberately throwing themselves at him to wear down his swords. While he dealt with them, a massive shadow suddenly covered him. An ogre had leapt into the air and came crashing down with a punch aimed straight at him. Gray blocked the blow with his sword, but the force behind it was overwhelming and blasted him away. He coughed up blood as his body trembled violently. His breathing turned ragged, and he stared in disbelief at the shattered remains of one of his swords. Now he only had one left. Facing hordes of ogres alongside the general with a single sword was practically impossible. From the experience he carried before regressing, Gray already knew there was no chance of victory. Since that was the case, he urged his master to escape while the ogres remained focused on him. Saria looked amused by his suggestion, but she refused immediately while defending herself from incoming attacks. Gray questioned whether she intended to die meaninglessly. He assured her that he would escape afterward as well, but Saria explained that wasn't the problem. A grim expression spread across her face before turning into one of resignation as she admitted she could no longer run. Her leg had been deeply slashed and blood was pouring from the wound. Gray's face instantly turned pale after seeing her injury. At that moment, he realized he had run out of options. In his mind, there had only ever been one reason for returning to the past: defeating the Liquidator. He swung his sword again while accepting the possibility that he might die there. Moments later, his final sword shattered apart, yet Gray still refused to surrender. He desperately tried to remember the sensation of that power from long ago. His only thought was to draw upon it once more and destroy every enemy before him. As the ogres surrounded him, preparing to strike, he forced himself to focus on that memory. Gray tightly shut his eyes, desperately recalling the feeling he once experienced. The final fragment of his broken sword floated before him, and at that instant he reopened his eyes. They glowed a deep crimson red. He finally felt it again. A black shadow sword materialized in his hand as he swung it in a single motion, instantly cutting down several ogres. Dark mist wrapped around part of his face and blade. Saria stared at him in confusion. Gray wore a cold expression, but when he glanced toward her, he smiled reassuringly and told her everything would be fine. With another swing, several more heads flew into the air. The ogre general's weapon began glowing once again, but before it could react, Gray cut it down in a single instant. Saria noticed what happened, but while distracted, another ogre attempted to ambush her from behind. However, the attack suddenly felt weak compared to before. She realized the ogres that once overwhelmed her were now easy to cut down. Without the general strengthening them, they were nothing more than ordinary monsters. By the time the battle ended, the night had already grown deep. The two of them had finally defeated every ogre. Gray apologized for destroying Saria's sword, but she brushed it aside since he had saved her life. He handed the broken weapon back to her. Saria was about to question him about the mysterious power he used, but before she could speak, Gray suddenly collapsed face first onto the ground. Panic spread across her face as she called out his name. Gray's consciousness slowly drifted into a dark and endless realm. Confused, he wondered where he was. Everything around him was pitch black except for a single door standing before him. As he stared at it, black flames suddenly burned through the chains wrapped around the door. Gray immediately recognized the power. It was the same force he had just used in battle. He wondered if opening the door would allow him to wield that power again, but the thought itself filled him with unease. Even so, he slowly stepped closer. Suddenly, a terrifying presence emerged behind him. His entire body froze, forcing him to instinctively step backward. His breathing became shaky and uneven as fear consumed him. Deep inside, he understood one thing clearly. If he opened that door in his current state, he would die without question. Then, out of nowhere, a voice echoed through the darkness, saying he had made the correct choice. In the next moment, Gray jolted awake while gasping violently for air, his entire body drenched in sweat. Saria looked startled before realizing he had finally regained consciousness. Gray immediately asked where he was, and Saria explained that he was inside the village infirmary. She added that he had remained unconscious for 5 entire days and admitted she feared he might never wake up again. Once Gray realized how long he had been unconscious, he understood he had pushed his body far beyond its limit. Saria commented that pushing himself wasn't enough to describe what he had done. Still, she quickly asked whether he could move properly. Gray attempted to move his body but immediately noticed he couldn't gather any strength in his right arm. He could barely move it with effort, and that realization terrified him. If he lost the ability to hold a sword, everything would be over. Worse still, a strange black bruise covered his arm like spilled ink. Saria explained that she expected him to struggle moving it. Gray wondered if she could even see the strange black mark. He admitted that he couldn't put any strength into his dominant arm at all. Just as she expected, the injury wouldn't heal anytime soon because every bone in his right arm had been shattered. Gray was completely stunned. Oddly enough, he couldn't even feel pain. Saria explained that they used a magic potion to treat his injuries, which shocked him even further, since those potions were incredibly expensive. She told him not to worry because the village chief personally provided it. Gray couldn't understand why someone would use something so valuable on him. Saria looked confused by his reaction and reminded him that he had become the village's hero. Gray remained speechless. Suddenly the door burst open and the village chief entered the room. Gray immediately thanked him for the potion, but the chief insisted they should be the ones thanking him instead. With overwhelming emotion, the chief explained that Gray had defeated an ogre general, a monster powerful enough that even combined forces from nearby towns couldn't scratch it. If that creature had attacked unchecked, the entire village would have been annihilated. The chief tightly clasped Gray's hand and declared that if Gray hadn't killed the monster, none of them would still be alive. He added that without Gray and Saria, there would be no survivors, no infirmary, and no one left standing there speaking. Gray insisted the chief was exaggerating, but the chief firmly denied it. Deep down, Gray eventually realized the man was right. Before he regressed, this village had originally been destroyed during the ogre invasion. The village chief then mentioned hearing that Gray intended to take the academy entrance exam, and asked whether it was true. Gray only responded with a stunned "oh." Instantly, countless thoughts flooded his mind. He had defeated the ogre general a week before the exam, but after remaining unconscious for 5 days, only 2 days remained. Gray's face immediately paled after remembering the distance to the academy. Traveling there on foot required 3 full days, while horseback would only take 1. Unfortunately, he had no money for a horse. Without hesitation, he asked the village chief if he could borrow one. The chief smiled and explained that he had already anticipated the request and prepared the finest horse in the village for him. With that horse, Gray would arrive in time easily. Saria jokingly remarked that if he hadn't awakened that day, they would have carried him to the academy while he was still unconscious. She then opened the door, causing sunlight to pour into the room. Gray squinted before noticing the horse waiting outside alongside a massive crowd gathered around it. The villagers held banners while cheering for him, thanking him and wishing him success on the entrance exam. Bright smiles covered everyone's faces as they expressed their gratitude. Several villagers even approached him personally to thank him. One man stepped forward and handed Gray a small pouch. Confused, Gray asked what it contained. The villager explained that everyone in the village had contributed money after hearing how expensive it was to apply to the World Union Academy. Gray was deeply moved by their kindness. He smiled warmly before thanking them and joking that returning after failing the exam would feel embarrassing. Saria immediately reassured him not to worry. After all, he was probably the only applicant aiming for the World Union Academy who had defeated an ogre general. Despite that, Gray remained concerned about his injured right arm. Saria reminded him that his left arm was still perfectly functional. Gray quietly nodded in response. She confidently told him that was already more than enough, and that he didn't even need to rely on that strange power again. Gray argued that the entrance exam wouldn't be easy, especially while fighting with only one arm. Still, Saria reassured him with confidence. She said he'd definitely stand out and that the examiners would recognize his strength. She had complete confidence in him and insisted that he would definitely pass. Gray thanked her and said that with her saying it like that, he felt like he had no choice but to succeed. In his past life, the village had been destroyed, but now it was still standing. Gray realized the world was no longer the same, and that meant the future itself could change. It was all thanks to the power he possessed. With that thought in mind, he continued on his journey. Eventually, he arrived just in time and even thanked the horse for getting him there safely. He looked ahead and saw a city surrounded by a massive lake. He had finally arrived at the World Union Academy. Inside the arena, the host announced that they would begin distributing exam tickets. Until the process was finished, every examinee was ordered to remain inside the central arena. There were countless participants, yet only 20 would pass. Someone mentioned that the number of successful candidates changes every year. Sometimes 50 pass, while other times only 1 makes it through. The host then called Professor Ariel to the front. The baddie with red hair stepped forward and immediately began distributing the exam tickets. She instructed the examinees to take the paper that would appear before them before snapping her fingers. A golden light instantly filled the arena, and a sheet of paper appeared in front of every participant. Gray received examinee number 513 under the fencing course, and noticed that everyone else had theirs as well. Professor Ariel explained that they would only be able to see their number and course, reassuring them that this had always been the Academy's system. She gave a faint smile before explaining that the World Union Academy does not judge people based on age, gender, nationality, status, or even their names. She added that none of those things mattered within the academy. Only the individuals who passed the exam and earned the right to cross the bridge would be asked for their names, and even then they could provide fake ones if they wished. Gray found it confusing because even though he had left his sword at the inn, his paper still identified him under the fencing course. It made him curious about what kind of system the academy was using. Professor Ariel then explained that the courses had been assigned purely based on appearance. She told everyone that if their assigned course was incorrect, they should raise their hand immediately. The examinees were stunned. They couldn't believe she had sorted everyone simply by looking at them despite the overwhelming number of participants. Some assumed she had already investigated them beforehand, while others believed she might have used some kind of mind-reading magic. However, after waiting for some time, not a single person raised their hand. She concluded that nobody had been assigned incorrectly. Afterwards, she announced the exam schedules and instructed everyone to check their tickets. Gray saw that he was scheduled for the first day at 11 a.m. He disliked the timing because he had hoped for more time to recover his injured arm. Professor Ariel reminded everyone that the test was a one-shot practical exam. Anyone who arrived late would immediately be disqualified without exceptions or reschedules. Gray held his arm and thought about how he still couldn't use much strength. Deep inside, he hoped it would at least improve before tomorrow arrived. The next day finally came, but Gray's condition had not improved at all. His arm remained injured, leaving him with no choice but to take the exam in that state. When his number was called, he walked toward the arena entrance and took a deep breath, reminding himself not to think negatively. He evaluated his condition and realized that his left arm was still functional while his right arm could only move slightly. Using the remaining time before his turn, he carefully observed the examiner's movements and searched for possible openings. The examiner instructed the current examinee to attack first. The examinee charged forward and swung heavily, but the examiner effortlessly sidestepped every strike. The examinee shouted that he wasn't finished yet before gripping his sword with both hands and launching another attack. The examiner blocked it using only one hand. The moment that happened, the examinee completely lost confidence. The professor then rushed forward and blasted him away with a single swing. The man crashed onto his back and the examiner calmly concluded the test. He instructed the defeated participant to retrieve his weapon and leave the venue. After witnessing that scene, a small smile appeared on Gray's face because he already understood the situation. He believed he was completely finished. There was no way he could possibly win. Gray thinks to himself that he is already cooked. Not long after, the examiner called Gray's number. As he walked forward, he couldn't believe he had to fight someone who had effortlessly defeated a man twice his size with only one arm. Gray was instructed to attack first. Even though he felt hopeless, he still decided to do everything he could. He rushed forward while recalling what Saria had once taught him, that a sword is not swung using only the arms but through power generated by the entire body and channeled into the weapon. Even if his right arm was nearly powerless, he believed he could still force strength through the rest of his body. He swung his sword, causing the examiner to duck and evade it. Gray felt nervous because he could no longer fight the way he normally would. He realized that if swinging a sword without arm strength were easy, nobody would bother training their body in the first place. The examiner counterattacked, but Gray became confused the moment he saw the strike. The instructor's sword felt unexpectedly slow, allowing him to block it. Gray could sense that the examiner possessed overwhelming power, but his speed and technique didn't even come close to his master's. He started believing that if he relied on the swordsmanship he had learned from Saria, he might still compensate for the lack of strength in his arm. Gray's eyes sharpened as he realized that if that were the case, then he still had a chance. He adjusted his movements accordingly and became convinced that the examiner was slower and less overwhelming than he originally thought. He recalled his master's words about how he would definitely pass. Their swords clashed repeatedly, and to his surprise, he managed to overpower the examiner for a moment. That was when he finally started believing he could actually do it. Their duel continued, and although Gray had already grasped the examiner's swordsmanship, the difference in raw power remained enormous. Every time Gray attacked, the professor calmly evaded, making him realize that breaking through his defense would not be easy. He understood that winning with only one usable arm was far more difficult than he wanted to admit. Still, as the fight continued, the examiner's movements gradually became rougher. Gray noticed it immediately and came up with a risky plan. After finding the perfect timing, he deliberately baited the examiner into attacking him. The examiner swung exactly as Gray expected, leaving behind a massive opening. Gray shifted his weight onto his right foot despite knowing it would expose him as well. He understood that most opponents naturally commit to wide and obvious swings in situations like that. Unexpectedly, Gray had already slipped behind the examiner before anyone realized it. The examiner was completely caught off guard. Gray believed that no matter how overwhelming the difference in power was, victory would still be possible if he managed to get behind his opponent. However, before he could backshot the guy, they were suddenly ordered to stop. The tip of Gray's sword remained only an inch away from the examiner's back. Gray wondered if the match had really ended because it felt too early for it to stop there. Another examiner then announced that his time limit had expired. Gray's eyes widened the moment the result was declared. The match had ended in a draw. He became certain that he wouldn't pass. His grip on the sword loosened as though his body had completely given up. He left the arena feeling defeated because he had already given everything he had. He also understood that if he couldn't defeat the examiner now, things would only become harder for him in the future. Gray believed his arm would recover by next year, so he planned to take the exam again. Before leaving, he glanced back at the arena one final time and quietly expressed his gratitude. 1 week later, inside meeting room of the World Union Academy, the head of the academy asked the professors for their thoughts on the candidates now that every exam had concluded. One professor admitted that he felt completely exhausted, while an older professor commented that having everyone observe together was inefficient and suggested dividing the workload next year. Another professor argued that they couldn't risk overlooking talented individuals simply to make things easier for themselves. The head sighed and reminded them that he had asked for opinions regarding the examinees rather than complaints about the system. He then moved on to the swordsmanship course and asked who had passed. The professors watched the screens as one of them explained that, as always, those who defeated the examiners automatically passed, while the remaining candidates would be judged based on their performance and how long they endured during the 15-minute limit. The head asked the other swordsmanship instructors for their opinions. One professor replied that aside from those who defeated the examiners, candidates 5, 217, and 753 had stood out the most. Another professor suggested leaving it at that because even if more candidates were accepted, they likely wouldn't be able to keep up with the classes. The professor agreed and asked whether anyone objected. The discussion continued until the head eventually concluded that the successful candidates for the swordsmanship course had been finalized. However, someone suddenly brought up candidate number 513. The head turned toward the speaker and saw that it was Professor Ariel. She asked the others what they thought about candidate 513. Everyone turned their attention back to the screen. One professor described 513 as a rather small fighter. While watching the match, they admitted that it initially looked like he might actually win. However, they believed that relying on traps and setups just to defeat the examiner would make things difficult for him moving forward. They acknowledged that his technique was impressive, but his physical strength was lacking, making it feel as though he had been outmatched from the beginning. A brown-haired professor with a mustache bluntly stated that the candidate simply wasn't good enough. The others agreed with his opinion. Professor Ariel was left speechless because she couldn't believe that so many people had watched the match without noticing the real issue. She thought that if everyone remained blind to talent, then having all the professors observe together was completely pointless. The next day, Gray tightly held his exam ticket, as the results for the swordsmanship course were finally about to be announced. Only 6 people would pass. Everyone waited nervously as the first successful candidate, number 5, was announced. The moment the number was called, the examinee's ticket burst into flames. Soon after, candidate 217 was announced next. Next came the numbers 432 and 6115, followed by 753 and 925. That was the end of the list. Gray looked devastated when his number wasn't called. The successful applicants were instructed to cross the bridge and complete their enrollment before the day ended. While the others celebrated and congratulated the passers, Gray stood there silently with a defeated expression after failing the exam. Then another announcement echoed through the area regarding the Divine Eye special admission. Only a few seconds later, Gray's number was suddenly called and his exam ticket burst into blue flames. Everyone nearby stared at him in shock while Gray remained frozen in confusion. Murmurs quickly spread through the crowd. Some people sneered and claimed the academy must have cheated. Others criticized the World Union Academy, saying it had fallen to a new low. Gray overheard every word and became even more confused since he had no connections at all. Gray wondered if his master had secretly done something behind the scenes, but he hadn't heard anything about it. An old man suddenly scolded the crowd for insulting the Divine Eye admission. He explained that it was a prestigious category responsible for producing heroes for centuries. However, the crowd remained unconvinced. They argued that the title only carried respect in the past, and brought up several recent Divine Eye admissions like Amy White, Bella Albright, Leek Muller, and Jacob Bloomfield, calling them failures. Even the current candidates had already heard the rumors surrounding them, but Gray knew the truth better than anyone else. Those individuals had once been part of the main force that fought against the Liquidator. Now his name had been placed alongside theirs. Soon after, another announcement informed the students that the entrance ceremony would begin in 30 minutes. Once they had finished changing into their uniforms, they were instructed to gather at the plaza in front of the main office. Their uniforms featured a black pattern engraved with the Academy's symbol, and Gray looked surprisingly sharp while wearing it. Some students arrived at the plaza early, though many were unsure if they were even in the right place since nothing had been prepared yet. A man suddenly ran toward them and apologized for the delay, explaining that there had been a mix-up. He politely asked everyone to step back so he could place the stairs there. The students moved aside and asked if their new position was acceptable. The man replied that it was perfect before suddenly kneeling on the ground. Everyone watched in confusion as he touched the floor, causing a massive magic circle to appear beneath them. Moments later, the ground began to tremble and shift. The students stared in disbelief as an enormous structure slowly rose before their eyes. The man apologized once again for the delay before informing them that they could sit wherever they liked. The students were clearly amazed after realizing it was teleportation magic, though they could hardly believe something that large could actually be teleported. Gray sat down while thinking the Academy probably wanted the ceremony held somewhere, The massive building could easily be seen. To him, it felt like an unnecessarily extravagant use of teleportation magic. Still, he couldn't deny how excited he felt after witnessing the overwhelming scale of the World Union Academy's power. Some students then noticed there were far too many seats prepared. Since only 30 students had passed the exam, the setup seemed excessive. One girl expressed confusion, prompting another student to explain that the academy gathered elite students from all around the world, just as its name suggested. She then pointed toward the sky. The other girl looked up in shock after seeing dragons and aircraft flying overhead. She nervously asked what they were seeing. Gray was equally surprised after spotting the magic airship Strato Queen. He had boarded it once in his previous life when he joined the Liquidator Subjugation Squad. It was known as one of the largest airships in the world, so he couldn't believe the Academy used it merely for an entrance ceremony. At that moment, the World Union Academy completely surpassed all of Gray's expectations. The massive airship eventually landed, and more students began stepping out one after another. With everyone finally present, the entrance ceremony officially began. After some time, the headmaster finished his speech, though Gray looked completely uninterested. In his mind, the ceremony felt no different from any ordinary school event. The next part of the program introduced greetings from the top students of each course. Soon, Leon Hart, the highest-ranking student in the swordsmanship course, was invited onto the stage. As Leon Hart walked toward the stage, the students immediately began whispering about him. Rumors claimed he had defeated an examiner instantly during the entrance exam. Others even insisted his swordsmanship already rivaled that of the Academy's professors. Gray quietly observed him while Leon Hart approached the microphone. Before speaking, Leon Hart first confirmed with the faculty members if he was allowed to speak freely. They agreed, and he thanked them before stating that he had one complaint regarding the Academy. However, before addressing it, he formally greeted the students who had earned admission properly. He stated that it was an honor to stand beside them and encouraged everyone to graduate as individuals capable of contributing greatly to the world. He expressed his desire for all of them to work together and aim higher as students of the prestigious World Union Academy. However, his tone soon changed when he declared that someone among them didn't deserve to be there. Leon Hart then turned toward Professor Ariel and asked if she agreed with him. The sudden question caught her off guard. She calmly responded that every student present had passed the Academy's difficult examinations. Although some students might not be as talented as him, she didn't believe excluding them was wise. She then asked why he was bringing it up. Leon Hart glared at her before clarifying that he wasn't referring to the regular students. Instead, he accused her of secretly admitting someone through the Divine Eye special admission. He then demanded that the specially admitted student reveal himself, return the uniform, and leave the Academy immediately. The atmosphere instantly grew tense. Gray couldn't understand why Leon Hart sounded so hostile. Then he suddenly remembered that Leon Hart had been seated beside him earlier. Thankfully, Leon Hart didn't know what he looked like. Gray quietly thought that as long as he stayed silent, he could avoid being dragged into the situation. Professor Ariel casually remarked that the students that year were certainly lively. Leon Hart grew irritated after feeling like nobody was taking him seriously. He openly criticized her and demanded that she stop admitting students through the back door. At first, she remained silent. Then, in the blink of an eye, she suddenly leaned close and whispered into his ear, asking if he truly believed he was stronger than that student. Her unexpected movement shocked the entire arena. Leon Hart was caught completely off guard. After gritting his teeth, he answered yes, and asked if she intended to prove him wrong. Professor Ariel smiled in amusement and proposed a bet instead. Her suggestion immediately caught his attention. She boldly wagered both her position as professor and the special admission student's place in the academy. Meanwhile, Gray sat there completely confused about how the situation had escalated so quickly. Leon Hart narrowed his eyes before asking if she intended to force him into fighting the specially admitted student. Professor Ariel calmly denied it, stating that such an idea would be boring. She casually added that if Gray ever fought seriously, Leon Hart would probably die. As a responsible teacher, she explained that she had no intention of risking her students' lives. Veins bulged across Leon Hart's forehead as he felt deeply insulted, but Professor Ariel merely claimed she was speaking honestly. Instead, she proposed a safer challenge involving monsters. She stated that Leon Hart was far better at fighting monsters than people anyway. Though irritated, he admitted that she understood him well and finally asked what the bet actually involved. Professor Ariel explained that each of them would face monsters chosen by her, and the monsters would become stronger with every round. Whoever failed first would lose the bet. She continued by explaining the conditions. If Gray lost, she would resign from the academy, and every special admission student would be expelled. However, if Leon Hart lost, he would have to obey whatever request she gave him. Leon Hart then asked what kind of monsters they would be fighting. Although confident in his abilities, he had no intention of participating in something unreasonable. After thinking briefly, Professor Ariel finally revealed the first target, an ogre general. The entire class fell silent in shock, though Gray himself showed little reaction. Instead, he became curious why she specifically chose that monster. Leon Hart, however, exploded in anger and shouted that an ogre general was far too powerful for someone to defeat alone. Professor Ariel calmly clarified that they wouldn't have to fight immediately because they would be given an entire year to prepare. Leon Hart snapped in frustration, arguing that if people could defeat disaster-level monsters alone within a single year, the world wouldn't already be suffering. He accused her of intentionally choosing an impossible challenge so there could never be a clear winner. Confidently, he declared that he refused to play along with her scheme. Professor Ariel smirked before adding one final condition to the bet. She declared that if the match somehow ended in a draw, then Leon Hart would automatically be considered the winner. In simple terms, if Gray failed to defeat the Ogre General, she would lose her position and every special admission student would be expelled from the academy. She then asked Leon Hart what he thought about the terms. He stared at her like she had completely lost her mind. The more he thought about it, the more he felt the entire bet was already stacked against him. Since he stayed silent for several moments, Ariel took it as agreement. Leon Hart eventually warned her that the Ogre General better not be weakened or altered in any way. Ariel calmly assured him that it would be genuine. Then, with a flick of her hand, a feather pen materialized out of thin air. She explained that the conditions had already been written into a magic contract and told him to sign it if he had no objections. Leon Hart carefully read through the contract before ultimately deciding to accept it. Even so, he couldn't help but ask whether she truly believed Gray could actually win. Ariel only gave him a vague answer, saying that nobody could know for sure. After that, she quietly returned to her seat. The other professors immediately began whispering among themselves, wondering what had gotten into her. Some assumed she was simply using the bet as an excuse to retire from the academy. Considering she was already past her prime, the idea didn't seem impossible. Meanwhile, Gray realized he no longer had any choice in the matter. The bet had already become official. Still, something continued bothering him. Ariel had mentioned the monster he defeated before enrollment, even though the challenge allowed them an entire year to prepare. As Gray stared toward her, she silently placed a finger over her lips, signaling him to stay quiet. At that moment, Gray realized she had manipulated the situation from the very beginning. Eventually, the opening ceremony ended, and the students headed toward their assigned classrooms. Their first lesson was basic magic. Some students found it surprising that lectures had already begun on the very first day, but as academy students, they were expected to understand that every moment mattered. The professor immediately started explaining the fundamentals of magic. He taught that the body contained a hidden energy known as ether, which could be controlled through the body's magic circuits. As he continued writing formulas and explanations across the board, Gray quietly listened from his seat. At first, he worried that he might struggle to keep up with the class, but to his surprise, he had already learned everything during boot camp. So far, things were going smoothly. However, there was one major problem. Out of all the classes available, he somehow ended up in the same classroom as Leon Hart. Gray silently prayed that Leon Hart wouldn't discover he was the Divine Eye special admission student. The professor eventually noticed Gray looking uninterested during the lecture. He immediately called him out for already losing focus only 5 minutes into class. Gray was startled that the professor had noticed him despite sitting all the way in the back. He quickly apologized for his behavior. The professor then challenged him, asking if he could prove his confidence in front of the class. He sarcastically remarked that Gray should at least know how to use basic magic. Gray politely responded that since they belonged to the swordsmanship course, he assumed it was acceptable if they weren't skilled with magic. The professor quickly corrected him, explaining that even swordsmen needed to understand the fundamentals of magic to properly coordinate with mages during battle. He emphasized that understanding basic spells and knowing how they functioned was essential knowledge. Gray was surprised because the explanation sounded exactly like the one given during Subjugation Squad boot camp. That made him curious whether they would also learn the same spell. Gray then asked if they would be practicing Ether Bullet. The professor raised an eyebrow before asking if he could already use the spell. Gray admitted that he could. Hearing that made him feel relieved since it meant the brutal Subjugation Squad boot camp hadn't been pointless after all. Seeing an opportunity, the professor decided to arrange a small match. He mentioned that Leon Hart, whom he casually called Leon, could also use Ether Bullet. Leon Hart confirmed it before adding that he had trained in both swordsmanship and magic long before entering the academy. According to him, that made fighting another student seriously somewhat dangerous. However, the professor wasn't concerned at all. He explained that despite any differences in skill, they would only be using Ether Bullet, so nobody was likely to die. He also made it clear that he had no intention of asking Leon Hart to hold back. Then the professor suddenly exposed Gray's identity by revealing that he was this year's Divine Eye special admission student. The entire classroom immediately turned to stare at Gray. He instantly realized he was in serious trouble. Meanwhile, the professor wore a grin as though he enjoyed throwing the class into chaos. Leon Hart responded coldly, declaring that he would personally show Gray what kind of place the academy truly was. He glared directly at Gray and ordered him to step forward. Once the two stood face to face, the professor explained the rules. As soon as he gave the signal, both students would fire ether bullets at each other. Gray had only practiced magic for a few days during boot camp, and although the professor insisted it wouldn't be fatal, he doubted he would escape without injuries. The signal to begin was finally given. Leon Hart immediately prepared himself, determined to demonstrate the gap between them. Gray had no choice but to respond seriously. Leon Hart released a small baby blue orb of light, but when Gray activated his spell, a massive glowing blue sphere instantly formed before him. The next moment completely stunned the entire classroom. Even Gray himself couldn't believe what happened. His ether bullet completely overwhelmed Leon Hart's attack. Leon Hart cried out in shock as the enormous spell rushed toward him. The professor instantly stepped in and created a barrier in front of Leon Hart to protect him. At first, he felt relieved for stopping the attack, but his expression quickly changed when the barrier shattered apart. The impact exploded outward with a blinding flash and a violent gust of wind that swept across the room. Several nearby students were knocked back by the shockwave. Leonhardt screamed before crashing hard onto the floor. The professor immediately rushed over and asked if he was all right. Leonhardt slowly stood up and assured him he was fine. The professor sighed in relief before turning toward Gray with disbelief. He realized that if the barrier hadn't weakened the attack, Leonhardt might actually have died. Even more shocking, none of the professors at the academy could produce an ether bullet that powerful. The professor stared at Gray and demanded to know what he had just done. Gray looked genuinely confused. Leonhardt's ether bullet had felt incredibly weak to him, almost like it wasn't even the same spell. That made him wonder whether the ether bullet he learned during Subjugation Squad boot camp was completely different from the Academy's version. He cautiously asked if he had accidentally used the wrong spell. The professor quickly denied it and confirmed that it was definitely ether bullet. However, he explained that the quality of Gray's ether was completely different because it wasn't ordinary ether. According to him, Gray had created super compressed ether. The other students had never even heard of such a thing before. The professor admitted that even experienced mages struggled to properly control that kind of power. Yet Gray had not only produced it but also shaped it into a spell. He openly declared that nobody else in the academy could accomplish something like that. The students immediately began whispering among themselves. It was the first time any of them had seen an ether bullet with that much destructive power. Some students started believing the Divine Eye admission truly existed for special talents like Gray. Others argued that he should have been admitted directly into the magic course instead of receiving special admission status. But Gray himself felt deeply confused. Every spell he learned during boot camp had been like that, and compared to the others there, he was never considered particularly talented. He asked the professor if he was joking because he genuinely believed anyone could achieve the same results with enough practice. The professor burst into laughter after hearing that. Gray became even more confused when the laughter only grew louder. Then, without warning, the professor grabbed him by the shoulders, leaned into his personal space, and urged him to transfer into the magic course. He even offered to personally recommend him. According to the professor, Gray possessed far greater talent in magic than in swordsmanship. Gray politely refused, explaining that he had always been told he lacked talent for magic. The professor reacted as though Gray had just made the funniest joke imaginable. He couldn't believe someone capable of understanding ether compression well enough to create super compressed ether genuinely thought he was untalented. The professor described Gray as a once-in-a-generation genius and even called him a prodigy by academy standards. He added that whoever claimed Gray lacked magical talent clearly had no idea what they were talking about. Then he once again asked if Gray was absolutely certain he didn't want to switch to the magic course. Since the professor was known for rarely praising students, the entire class was stunned by how highly he spoke of Gray. He continued pressuring him, insisting that someone with his abilities avoiding magic would be a loss for the entire world. He even jokingly referred to it as a crime against magic itself. Gray nervously laughed before something suddenly clicked in his mind. He finally remembered where he had first heard about the ether compression technique. Back during Subjugation Squad boot camp in his previous life, someone had explained that people in ancient times didn't even know odd, also called life force, existed. Because of that, casting proper magic was extremely difficult. Mages had to continuously compress ether within their bodies and hope a small portion mixed with odd by chance, just to create a functional spell. A woman with baby blue hair and golden eyes had once mocked that process as inefficient and laughable. Back in the present, Gray cautiously asked the professor whether he had ever heard of odd before. The professor looked completely confused. That reaction confirmed Gray's suspicion. This world still had no knowledge of odd's existence. Gray quickly realized something important. Everything he learned during boot camp came from knowledge that belonged to the future, meaning he needed to be extremely careful about revealing it. The professor eventually returned the conversation to the topic of transferring courses and once again asked if Gray wanted to join the magic department. Gray respectfully bowed and apologized before explaining that he genuinely loved swordsmanship. Although he appreciated the offer, he had no intention of leaving the swordsmanship course. The professor accepted his decision, but assured Gray that he would always be welcome if he ever changed his mind. Gray sincerely thanked him before returning to his seat. The professor then announced that he would no longer scold Gray for appearing bored during lectures or even for leaving class early because the material was obviously too basic for someone with his level of understanding. The students were amazed after hearing Professor Carlos praise Gray so highly. Meanwhile, Leonhardt quietly watched Gray from a distance while clutching his chest. His cheeks even turned slightly red as he stared at him with admiration before calling him Lord Gray. The reaction sent chills down Gray's spine because it honestly felt unsettling. Later that day, Gray received a letter from Professor Ariel requesting that he visit her office after class. The sudden summons completely caught him off guard. He wondered whether it had something to do with Professor Carlos. He guessed that she was probably planning to recommend that he transfer to the magic course as well. When he arrived at her office, he stopped in front of the door. Before he could even knock, Professor Ariel called out from inside and informed him that the door was unlocked. The moment he stepped inside, someone suddenly attacked him. He instantly drew his sword and blocked the strike with ease. The girl who attacked him looked completely stunned. Gray realized his body had reacted purely on instinct. but he still questioned why she had attacked him in the first place. Then he finally saw her face clearly and froze in shock. She looked familiar, like someone he had seen before. From across the room, someone praised him for reacting well. It was Professor Ariel, and according to her, he had just proven that her eyes had judged him correctly. Another man nearby asked whether Bella had been holding back. He wanted confirmation on whether Professor Ariel had instructed her to go easy on him. The professor explained that Bella's movements had been flawless, making it unnatural for her sword to be knocked away so easily. The moment he heard her full name, Gray finally confirmed that she truly was Bella Albright, the future Grand Sorceress herself. Professor Ariel could not believe the two professors were seriously questioning her judgment. She bluntly stated that if they could not tell whether Bella Albright had been serious or not, then they should quit being professors altogether. One of them laughed and admitted that they had only been joking. Since he lost the bet, he tossed her several coins. Confused, Gray asked what they had been doing. Professor Ariel casually explained that they had placed bets on whether he could defend himself against Bella Albright's surprise attack, and thanks to him, she had earned a good amount of money. Afterwards, she tossed him his share. His jaw dropped the moment he caught the gold coin. That single coin alone was worth a fortune. The other professor then commented that the exchange earlier had revealed something interesting. During the fight, Gray had deliberately avoided using his dormant arm, almost as if he were protecting it. One professor speculated that it might have been caused by an injury. The other corrected him and explained that it seemed deeper than a simple muscle wound. Both professors agreed that an ordinary injury would not create such a condition. Gray could not believe they had figured that much out just from watching him for a few moments. The professors replied that if they could not notice something like that, they would never have become academy professors in the first place. However, Professor Ariel admitted that she had already noticed it during the entrance exam. Afterwards, she told the two professors to leave now that they understood the situation. She firmly declared that Gray was her student, and she had no intention of handing him over. The professors admitted that he possessed potential, but they warned that if the wound never healed, then he still failed to meet the Academy's standards. Before leaving, they reminded him to keep that in mind. Once the nuisances were finally gone, Professor Ariel shifted the discussion toward magic. The two of them sat down and talked over tea. She revealed that she had already heard about him using super compressed ether during Professor Carlos's class. He was surprised that the information had already reached her. She explained that Professor Carlos had personally visited her office and requested that Gray be transferred into the magic course. Naturally, she refused because she believed he was far more suited for the sword than for magic. Hearing that completely surprised him. She added that he did not look skilled in ether compression at all, nor did he show any signs of having practiced it before. He became overwhelmed by how accurately she had judged him just from observation alone. Because of that, he decided not to lie anymore. It was exactly as she said. She then asked what kind of trick he had used. She promised that she would never reveal his secret to anyone, and even offered him a reward in exchange for the truth. She explained that she desperately needed to know for Bella Albright's sake. Hearing that almost made him accidentally refer to her as the future sorceress. Professor Ariel continued by explaining that Bella Albright was a genius in magic theory, though she was far from exceptional when it came to actually using magic. For some unknown reason, she simply could not use ether compression properly. That was the exact reason she could not create super compressed ether. Gray remembered hearing in his previous life that Bella Albright had been considered a late bloomer. Then Professor Ariel continued her explanation. According to what she heard from Professor Carlos, when Gray used super compressed ether, it did not appear as though he compressed ether at all. That made her wonder if there was a way to use super compressed ether without actually compressing ether itself. If such a method truly existed, then Bella Albright would not need to be sent to Professor Varian Bradley. The moment he heard that name, Gray instantly recognized it. He immediately asked whether she was referring to Professor Varian Bradley. She realized from his reaction that he already knew who the man was. She admitted that it was nearly impossible not to know him because he was incredibly infamous. After all, he had conducted countless human experiments, murdering many people in the process. On top of that, he was responsible for multiple magic disasters that killed tens of thousands. He was known throughout history as the worst magic criminal of all time. While Gray was shocked that during that period, Varian Bradley still had not been arrested.